formal definition that I really like is that environmental justice is the fair and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Fair treatment means that no population bears a disproportionate share of negative environmental consequences from industrial, municipal, and commercial operations. Meaningful involvement includes the ability in all communities to make informed decisions and take positive actions that produce environmental justice in these communities. I think more broadly, to me, a less formal definition, environmental justice means that all people have access to clean air, to clean water, to open spaces, but also it means that people feel safe in their communities, that they have good health, and that we all have access to these things. These are things that every human being wants. We all want to have clean air and water. We all want to enjoy nature and be able to enjoy our parks and open spaces safely. We all want to have decent and adequate housing, access to great and delicious foods. These are things that we all want. So environmental justice means that all people on the planet have access to these basic human needs, these things that all human beings want. What is environmental racism? Again, a more formal definition is that environmental racism refers to the way in which minority group neighborhoods, where primarily people of color and members of low socioeconomic groups live, are burdened with a disproportionate number of hazards, and these include living near toxic waste facilities and garbage dumps, just to name a couple.
So to me, environmental justice is sort of, in a simple way, environmental justice. It's talking about the ways that climate change intersects with issues of justice. So issues of people's day-to-day lived experience and how fair it is in comparison to others. In the context of the climate crisis, I would say it a lot of times is about who is most impacted by the climate crisis. At the end of the day, what identities do they fall in? What vulnerabilities are they already coming up against? Environmental racism is the way that the system manifests, is the way that climate change gets manifested in the ways that the system is already unfair in a lot of ways. So black and brown people tend to be closer to certain
looking at environmental justice and environmental racism really are useful things to start the framework of looking at climate change in the environment and everything. So first off, like thinking about environmental justice is kind of a shift over the years to this idea of environmental justice as opposed to just like environmentalism or just trying to save the environment. And I think that to me, when I hear environmental justice, what I hear and what I've also read about is like really this framework that's based on equity and interconnectedness, rather than like viewing kind of the environment as something outside of humanity that needs to be saved, but understanding that we need to save the environment in order to save ourselves, but also that there are systems in place that actually perpetuate continued destruction of the environment, but that also means the destruction of the people that live within that environment as well. And thinking about environmental racism, I think that the key point there is thinking about when we think about power plants. So oftentimes in the environmental movement, we talk about pipelines, we talk about power plants, we talk about fossil fuels, we talk about all these important things. But we need to ask ourselves, where are these? Where are the power plants? Where are the factories? Where are the pipelines going through? Oftentimes people of color are subjected to live in places that are much more highly polluted, next to power plants, and there are tons of examples there. Pipelines, specifically, has been more of a hot button issue in the sense of discussing indigenous nations and treaty rights, and how the people who live near pipelines are often indigenous people on the front lines of these pipelines and are going to suffer when an oil spills. It's not if, it's a matter of when. So I think this idea of environmental racism is really about how people of color are disproportionately affected by policies that both destroy the environment, but they are more affected by it. And so understanding that and understanding that imbalance, I think, is important for our framework in fighting for environmental justice.
Around the world, members of minority groups bear a greater burden of the health problems that result from higher exposure to waste and pollution, and the stats on environmental racism are shocking. Research shows that in the United States, that environmental racism pervades all aspects of African Americans' lives. This includes having poor quality housing from an environmental standpoint, schools with asbestos problems, playgrounds with lead paint. In fact, one study found race to be more important than socioeconomic status in predicting the location of the nation's commercial hazardous waste facilities.
For kind of the examples of what myself and People's Green New Deal-Madison kind of organized around and what we're concerned about in Wisconsin, some key examples we can immediately look at is Line 5 is a very clear example, which Enbridge is trying to redo Line 5, which goes from Superior, Wisconsin, all the way through the Upper Peninsula and down to, I believe, Detroit is where it ends. And it specifically goes through treaty land, but also specifically the Bad River Ojibwe Reservation up in northern Wisconsin. And they're fighting to not allow that to come through. And understanding that's connected to Line 3, which is in Minnesota, coming from the tar sands. So all these pipelines are interconnected, and obviously who's going to face the brunt of it? The brunt of that issues are going to be faced by indigenous people who are exercising their treaty rights, who are living in these areas, will be subjected to those spills, and their livelihoods will be subjected to those spills. And we could go on to other issues such as I-94, which People's Green New Deal is starting to talk about a little bit more, which is I know Sierra Club is very familiar with this. And has been part of the lawsuit over the years. Governor Evers trying to expand I-94 in the Milwaukee area, which highways we know have continued to perpetuate car travel as well as exacerbate white flight. And so the people who are living closest to these interstates are going to be people of color, working class people who are going to breathe in those toxins in the air more than others. We are not going to have a multiracial environmentalist movement, and we're not going to actually have the power we need to deal with an issue that is so essential to all the other issues if we're not able to stick our necks out and see the interconnectedness between a systematic racism and stopping the climate crisis.
I personally don't believe that it's possible to end the climate crisis without ending classist and racist systems, because like I said, I believe they come from the same fundamental flawed systems at the end of the day.
Answer this question is to refer to a quote by Martin Luther King Jr., and he said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Basically, I take this to mean that we cannot live in a society where some people have a great deal and other people have nothing, where some people have access to clean air and water and safe housing and good food, and other people do not have access to these things. You can never have a peaceful society when we have such extremes. Everyone deserves clean air and water. Everyone deserves good food. Everyone deserves decent and adequate housing. Again, so we all need to care. Regardless of your personal situation, we all need to care because we are all in this together. And until we have a society where everybody has access to these, again, basic human needs, these things that every human wants, a decent standard of living, where every human being has a decent standard of living, then we can never have any peace. Because when you have and have-nots, then there's always going to be disharmonious relationships, and to go even further than that, there's going to be violence like the types that we are seeing in the United States today.
Environmentalists should be concerned about environmental racism because, well, climate change as an issue. People who fight against climate change should be concerned about racism, period, because a lot of the fundamental issues that have led to climate change and that make it manifest in our day-to-day lives are the same as the ones that have led to the racial justice issues that we're in the United States today. It's usually white supremacy, extractive capitalism, the patriarchy, these systems of power and privilege feed into climate change very similarly to the way they feed into environmental racism.
Can't actually grapple with the extractive origins and nature of the American state and throughout the world, we're not going to be able to have the people power to actually challenge and actually stave off climate devastation, because we have to think about it strategically too. If we can't actually connect these issues and build coalition within the movements, we're not going to be able to actually have the political power to actually implement even reform policies that could change things dramatically, both in this country and around the world.
I think the first role that mostly white environmental groups should play is to listen. I know for myself that this summer, it was like some of the events of the summer of 2020, it was like a veil lifted off of my eyes, and I was staring my white privilege in the face. This summer has been pivotal for me to realize exactly how much privilege that I have enjoyed in my life, something that even in ways I had never thought of before. And for me personally, I know that I have a lot to learn. And I think mostly white environmental organizations should first listen. We need to reach out to the movement for Black lives and other movements for justice, and we need to really hear what people are saying. We need to listen to the stories. So first, I think we need to listen, and then we need to be allies. We need to listen, we need to learn, and we need to find out how we can support these movements for justice, because environmental justice is racial justice. They're intertwined, they're linked. And so I know for me personally, and I think for groups, mostly white environmental groups as a whole, that we need to listen. We need to recognize what we don't know. We need to learn. And then we need to be allies. We need to join in these causes and recognize that they're really all one and the same.
Understanding our history on the environmental, in the environmental movement, and how do we transform that history, but also understanding that there's a huge, rich history of people of color fighting for environmental justice. Specifically Indigenous people, African Americans that have been doing it for centuries. Fighting for their land and fighting to live a different way than the American capitalist way. So I think that's really important first step. But also, actually, this goes for any white activist, in my opinion, is trying to help make those connections. But also showing up and listening, and not just saying hey, we're just like this white environmental group, but actively walking the walk and talking the talk, constantly showing up to protests that quote unquote aren't environmental.
Environmental organizations right now, with everything that's happening in terms of racial justice in the United States, need to be taking a huge step towards education and educating themselves about abolition and educating themselves about systems of power and privilege and oppression to the bottom line, and realizing that we can no longer just point to like environmental racism as the crux of where climate change and racial justice intersect, because they come from the same issues. If we're trying to build an intersectional movement, we need to be able to educate people about the fact that saying abolish the police isn't necessarily that much more radical than saying we need to end fossil fuel infrastructure. It's about taking down what doesn't work for us anymore, and it's about reframing our system in entirely new ways. And so environmental organizations need to become privy to what communities of color are looking for in the world that we're trying to build, because defeating climate change is going to mean having a really clear picture of the world we want next.
Things I'm personally involved with is that we are really starting to be aware of these issues. And one of the ways we're doing this is through our equity committee. We've had an equity committee before, but I think now the importance of this committee has been realized during this summer of 2020. So we are coming back strong. We're recruiting new members, and we're looking at things that we can do as an organization to reach out to other justice movements like Black Lives Matters, that we can listen, as I said before, that we can learn from these movements, and that we can be allies with these groups. And really, the Equity Committee, in every part of our work, as we advocate for clean air, clean water, mass transportation, shutting down coal plants, that these issues are not separate from racial justice issues, that racial justice issues are linked, and that we need to be mindful of this, and also bringing more people, joining together with people of diverse voices who may not be represented in the Sierra Club right now. So question number 6, what solutions can we be fighting for that decrease systemic injustices and carbon emissions at the same time? We can be closing down the remaining 6 coal plants in Wisconsin. We can be shutting down coal plants across the United States. We can be transitioning to sources of renewable energy such as solar, and making it possible for communities of color and lower socioeconomic communities to have access to install solar in their housing and their schools. Climate change is largely being driven by carbon emissions, and burning coal is one of the leading causes of carbon emissions, or leading producers of carbon emissions. So closing down these coal plants is vitally important. It's also, we must know that definitely communities of color are disproportionately impacted by coal plants. They live closer to the coal plants. Burning coal produces toxic coal ash. So when people wake up, we've had instances in Wisconsin where people have woken up and they've seen black dust. It's toxic coal ash that has been on their cars and on children's playgrounds, and this is from burning coal. So we must close down the remaining coal plants in Wisconsin and all across the United States, and transition to clean energy, solar, wind. These sources of energy don't have the negative environmental and toxic effects for people's health that burning coal does. And we also know that burning coal, in addition to the toxic coal ash, it causes all kinds of problems: premature birth weights in newborns. Lower birth weights in newborns, asthma, heart disease, cancer, just a host of negative effects. So one of the best solutions that we can have so that we can fight systemic injustices and decrease carbon emissions at the same time is closing coal plants, the remaining coal plants across the United States.
rallying around the call to defund the police is really important, and environmentalists need to see how that is important to the environmental movement as well. It's not just something, obviously people of color in this country have faced police brutality from day one, and that's an injustice. Those same police officers defend pipelines. We saw in Standing Rock in 2016 that the Morton County Police were out there spraying pepper spray and water and on cold nights at Standing Rock, and other police forces were sent from around the country. In Duluth, Minnesota, they have increased their budget for police in anticipation for protest against Line 3. So understanding those connections, I think, are really important. And then also actively trying to reach out and understand that there are environmental organizations that are not white, that are multiracial, or that are indigenous-led or Black-led, and making those connections and trying to build coalition and listening and trying to find a path forward that builds a broad multiracial movement, because that's what we need in order to stave off climate catastrophe.